great afternoon or evening, wherever you are with this event. So my name is Bob Troia, and today I'm going to talk about how we can use data and self-experimentation to gain insights about ourselves, and then use that to guide our self-optimization journeys. So like many of you, I consider myself a biohacker. I've gone pretty deep down the biohacking rabbit hole, and just finding ways to optimize my body and my mind and all aspects of my biology. And it also obviously has included lots of coffee with butter and supplements. I'm also obsessed with data, and over the years I've gathered a lot of data about myself. And a few years back, I started blogging to document and share some of my self experiments and the data I've gathered, which you can find at quantifiedbob.com. Now, a lot of people, they consider biohacking and self-quantification to be the same thing, and they are closely related, but they actually differ in a few key ways. For example, someone into biohacking is probably not interested in identifying which of the 50 things they're doing is actually helping, as long as they're getting a net result that they like. And Quantified Self, while their tagline is self-knowledge through numbers, it's not just about optimizing biology. People are doing everything from tracking productivity to even tracking the books they're reading. I like to think of myself as a blend between the two. And it's really about identifying what personally works best for each of us, and then gets us to an optimal state that we seek. So when I began tracking years ago, the tools were very simple and basic, and technology is now allowing us to understand ourselves in ways never before possible. In my teens and 20s, my focus was on athletic performance, and as I've gotten older, things have shifted more towards longevity and overall personal optimization, but I still want to kick some butt. So I use self-tracking to discover insights about myself and then optimize for what does or doesn't work for me, or at least gets me 80% of the way there. And my background is as a technology entrepreneur, and there's a great business quote that goes, "You can't manage what you can't measure." And it really just means that you can't know whether or not you're successful unless success is defined and then tracked. But I do feel that this goes beyond business and can be applied to understanding and optimizing ourselves. So you really need to think about biohacking as taking a systems approach to self-optimization, since turning any of these knobs will, in effect, will affect all the others in some way. And my goal today isn't going to be to tell you how to sleep better or be stronger. But there are a lot of speakers that were already on today, and that they're subject matter experts in those fields. I want you to just come away after this talk thinking about ways that you can start tracking, measuring, and optimizing any areas that interest you. So what can we measure? These are just a few of the things that I've personally tracked. Not tracking every single one of these right now concurrently, but at some time I have. There's some that I track more frequently, daily, all the time. Some of it's very passive tracking. Some of it, like when you get into lab testing, may be less frequent, maybe 6 months or quarterly. And there's a lot here, but these are all things you can track on your own. Like at home, we have the tools to do it. And so how do we track these things? So first up is biometrics. So anyone that's sort of in biohacking self-quantification probably has some type of wearable, whether it's something an Apple Watch or something in the Android Wear family, or BioStrap, Fitbit, and Whoop trackers that are worn on the wrist. And then we've got ones that are on the finger, like companies like Aura. And there's body composition. Many of us have scales in our homes. These body impedance scales use a small amount of electricity to measure our body composition. There's higher end ones that you can go to a clinic and get even more detailed assessments. Then there's DEXA. DEXA uses a small amount of radiation to generate kind of look inside you and really provide a detailed analysis about bone mass and fat distribution. And if you want to kind of see what you look like on the outside in a three-dimensional way, there's now 3D body scanners where you can stand on a tripod, and within basically 60 seconds, it will generate a model with all your dimensions, and you can see where things are out of balance. Then there's vital signs. This This has been really important in the past few months, given the whole COVID crisis going on, because we're finding out from a lot of companies that are making these devices that there are some predictive measurements and things you can look at to detect ahead of time whether either someone's at risk or potentially has some of the symptoms that are going on. But I think in general, tracking vital signs, even if you're just looking for general readings or historical readings or something less extreme, maybe just a regular flu, are important. So we've got body temperature, blood pressure, and as Scott Sure mentioned in his talk, blood oxygen saturation. And these are all, again, simple, relatively inexpensive devices you can use at home. Then there's metabolic health. So many of us are using blood glucose and ketone monitors to look at our levels of each of those to see how our body's using them for energy. And in the past few years, we now have access to continuous glucose monitoring. So instead of having to prick our finger to get at each individual measurement, it's collecting data nonstop for anywhere from 10 days to 2 weeks. Then there's sleep. Now, while the activity trackers I showed earlier all will do some level of sleep tracking, these are other methods for tracking sleep. There's some devices that will use EEG to measure brain activity, which I personally feel are like the most accurate sensors for doing sleep analysis. Just the problem is the act of wearing it may disrupt your sleep, so it kind of is nets out. There's bed sensors that will basically look at the vibration of your breathing and your heart rate and movement to determine your sleep. And then there's actually apps that will run on your phone that you can, some of them you can just set on the bedside or on a different part of the room which will analyze the ambient sound, and sometimes they even will give you audio cues back to sort of help induce certain states of sleep. Then there's diet and nutrition. Many of us have probably kept a food journal at some point. There are apps like MyFitnessPal that will do pretty detailed nutrient tracking, so you can get it if you really want to get a good breakdown of what's going on. You can enter in all of those foods. There are photo-based food journals. I happen to have built one a while back, and there's plenty of them though. And the idea is you're just keeping a record on. There's a lot of information in those photos if you don't want to keep track every little calorie. And you can go the other way. If you want to track your fast, there are apps now that will manage your fasting for you. Then there's stress and recovery. We've got heart rate variability, which is a really important measurement of your body's kind of state, physiological state. And it can be measured in different ways. So we've got overnight HRV, which a lot of the wearables will do. They'll basically give you an average. They'll look at your HRV. They'll take some readings overnight and give you an average value, which you can then trend day to day. But there's another way where you can take a reading right when you wake up, and using some apps that will, again, day to day show you your state. And I don't think either is better or worse. I think the trick is you have to just use one consistently because it's all about the trends. And then sometimes you want to actually have real-time HRV. Like if I was tracking my HRV right now with, like, let's say the polar chest strap below, you could see how calm or stressed I am as I'm giving this presentation. And these are just some of the ways you can get heart rate data or HRV data. Chest straps, you can actually use the camera and the flash on the phone. And there's devices like the CoreSense sensor, which will send Bluetooth data to the phone. Then there's genetics. So a lot of people probably started with something in the US. We have 23andMe, which isn't a full genome sequence, but it was the first sort of consumer affordable service to do it. Now there's companies doing full genome sequencing, which was $1 million just a few years ago. Now I think I did a Dante Labs one right around the holidays, and I think I paid $200 for a full genome sequence, which is unbelievable. And then you can take this data and run it through third-party software, which will actually then take the raw data and crunch it all down and kind of look at risk factors and tell you where things may be out of whack, or you may have a risk factor, for different areas. Or you can use that data to help personalize things like nutrition and fitness. Then there's gut microbiome testing, and we're seeing a kind of an explosion of companies coming out doing this, because when they first started, it was just showing you kind of, here's the bacteria that are in your gut. They didn't have a whole lot of analysis of the data, mainly because there weren't the sample sizes that were really needed. But now they're crunching all this data using machine learning and artificial intelligence, and they're able to now, just by looking at your microbiome data, understand your glucose response to the foods and other risk factors, or just dial in your diet in certain ways. Then there's exercise. So this is more around the concept of efficient exercise and data-driven exercise. We've seen a lot of facilities opening up around the world. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not open at the moment just because of what's going on in the world right now. But there are devices out there that allow us to do strength training really efficiently within 10, 15 minutes that analyzes and gives us data points on every part of every rep that we do, which is really cool. And then we've got the same on the cardio side, where they can give you proxies to understanding your VO2 max just by doing, let's say, 2 20-second all-out sprints in 10 minutes. And now we have the ability to do really great like metabolic testing, whereas you used to have to hook yourself up to a big cart with a hose and go on a treadmill as hard as you can. Now you can wear devices that will show you, are you burning fat or are you burning carbs in any situation? So you may want to see what happens when you're out for a run versus playing a sport. Then in terms of mind, so this isn't about brain training. This is just about measuring brain activity or understanding what's going on inside there. So we've got EEGs, which measure brain activity, similar to what we saw for sleep. Neurocognitive testing, like CNS vital signs, which will give you a pretty thorough assessment of different areas of your working memory, virtual memory, recall, all those things. And then there's a device called Brain Gauge, which looks like a computer mouse, and you basically do a 10-minute test on any laptop, and it will give you a really dead-on assessment of what's going on. And you can track that over time and see if you've done things that affect it positively or negatively. Then there's the environment. So we can measure our air quality. There's personal air quality monitors now that you can clip on your backpack or carry it around with you, and it's superimpose that with your location data to see what happens when you go, let's say, commute to work or go for a bike ride. What's the air quality like? As well as devices that are in your home. We have water quality testing. There's plenty of products out there that will let you do that inexpensively. A lot of people are interested in EMFs and radiation, things like that in the home. These are 2 popular meters that will help kind of measure what's going on if you want to kind of go through your home, hack your space. And then you can even use apps to track your exposure to sunlight. So I use this to track especially in summertime, I'm measuring every time I'm out in the sun, outside on the beach, and it will try to predict your vitamin D levels based on your height and how much clothes you have on, how overcast it was, et cetera, and your latitude, where you are in the world. Then there's longevity and biological age. So we've got things like telomere testing. I'm not sure if anyone gave a talk on that today, but the idea of seeing the strands of your DNA and basically able to predict what your biological age versus your chronological age. And then there's epigenetic testing. So epigenetic testing is understanding the effects of the environment on you. So it could be everything from exposure to cigarette smoke and just the environment, pollution, et cetera. And then we've got biomarker-based testing where they're actually taking a bunch of other measurements and saying like, well, there's not one perfect score. It's like you might have this summary score and you might be like your cardiovascular health's really good, but your immunity system's really not. So that's something you have to work on. And now tracking itself, it does present some challenges. So for example, all devices have an inherent margin of error. And here's a comparison of 2 different tracking wearables I would use and the number of steps per day it reported, right? And so they're clearly not the same. But the trends are similar, which is the important part, because the lesson learned here is that regardless of what device you're using to track your activity, over time, it's not really whether you took 8,000 or 10,000 steps. It's about the fact that you increased your activity by 20%. So to me, those are the most important types of metrics, those trends. We have to also look at things like the consistency of when you take measurements. So there's often a circadian rhythm to things like blood pressure, heart rate, glucose, et cetera. And if you're going to take blood pressure, at 8 a.m. every day, well, make sure you're doing that all the time or take it several points in the day, because you might catch it at an off moment, or if you took it one day at 10 a.m. and then took another one at 4 p.m., you're going to get very different numbers, and it may not give you an accurate trend. And then there's this whole concept of correlation does not imply causation. So this is an analogy where if you look on the y-axis, it's global temperature, right? So you can, and the x-axis, the lower axis, is how many pirates are active in the world. And so in 1820, on the far right, there were like 45,000 pirates, and global temperature was much lower. But over the years, we've seen as the number of pirates have reduced, global temperatures have gone up, and there's pretty much a good curve that fits that. And so, if I was to say, well, hey, it correlates. So I would, if we want to stop global warming, we should all become pirates. So we have to understand sometimes what data we're looking at in the context of it. And so what do we do with all this data? I've been collecting a lot of data, and a few years back, I got a little frustrated. I just built my own data warehouse because I happen to have a background in software development and technology. And so I was able to kind of put all my data in one place because I wanted to control it and be able to do what I want with it in terms of analysis. And I realized that most people out there are not software engineers. They're not going to be able to do that. And so now there are some tools that will let you pull in all this information. You can play in the ecosystems of like Google Fit and Apple Health. They'll pull stuff off. A lot of the apps integrate with it. The wearables integrate with it. And so that's a really simple way to kind of get that data if you're just trying to aggregate it, but you're giving it to them essentially. And then there's apps like Gyroscope and Heads Up, which will let you connect a bunch of different things in, and you can look at, if you want to look at some charts and graphs, and some of them do pretty nice data visualizations. But honestly, if you're just getting into this, you can start simple. Get a spreadsheet, record your weight. That's here's something I did. Okay, date, weight, body fat percentage, and I included source. So you can make a chart out of that, right? So like I've been tracking weight for a long time. This is 10 years of my body weight data. That it's just essentially it's like that spreadsheet essentially in a chart, over 10 years. And you can see I've gone through different tools and things I've used. But what's cool is once you have this trend, data over time gives you a story. You can see when I was training for a marathon, or I was bulking up, or I got lazy, or just a lot of playing lots of soccer. And so it's cool to be able to zoom back out and take a look at that big data. So I always tell people, especially if it's passively collected data, it's like, even if you're not going to look at it, you have it. So if you want to go back to it years later, it's great to do. We can also find other trends. This is my heart rate variability data. I think it was from Aura. And what it shows is higher HRV is better. And so you'll see it tends to peak in the summertime, and it goes down in the winter, it comes back up, and it happens year after year. So it's kind of an interesting trend that I had noticed, and actually this year it's no different. I'm actually seeing my HRV jumping up right now as we get into July and August. We can also find some cool trends, like if you happen to track your alcohol consumption. This is HRV, again, waking up, higher numbers are better, lower or worse. And so where there's 2 glasses, that's kind of maybe I had too many drinks in this case, and my HRV tanked, right? Shouldn't have, I overdid it that night. But what was interesting was if I just have 1 or 2 glasses of wine, like at dinner, it actually increased, my HRV actually goes up. And it really kind of shows us for some things, there's a dose response curve. There could be a sweet spot where actually, you get a better result at some point, and then it's diminishing returns or things get back to the negative. We can also try to optimize sleep. So I was seeing, this is my BioStrap data. It was showing I was waking up a lot throughout the night. I didn't remember it, but I noticed that looking at the pulse, my blood oxygen saturation overnight, which it also reports on, I could see where my awakenings were happening where the SpO2 was dropping. And so I started mouth taping while I sleep, the forced breathing through my nose. It prevented me from stopping breathing at all during the night. And now my sleep is, it's been a game changer for me. So I want to spend a couple minutes talking about some experiments I've done around some glucose, because again, glucose is one data point, just a number. In the US, we use milligrams per deciliter. Around the world, it's millimolars per liter. And I became interested a few years back because my genetic test showed I had an elevated risk, even though my levels were considered okay. They weren't optimal, but they were, they were okay. So I started just taking, every morning I took a fasted glucose reading. And, you see some fluctuation. Some days were higher, some days were lower. And as I gathered this data, I started aggregating it by day of week. And I've noticed, for example, that on certain days, like Wednesday to Thursday, like Friday to Saturday, there would be a drop, like a noticeable drop. And those happen to be days that I would actually play soccer or football, depending where you live, in the evening. And so that actually would have a positive effect on my glucose the following morning. And I kept doing this. This is like every morning, again, doing the same thing over, I think, about 7 months here. And what was interesting was you started looking at what was going on, what things I was doing in these times that would affect glucose. So I was taking a certain supplement, which clearly was bringing that, the blue is a trend line, like I think 7-day moving average, and it would drop it. I happened to do some really long trips kind of close to each other. And you saw how that had an effect on my glucose levels, even several days like after I arrived somewhere. So it's, I think, just the stress in the body from travel and flying. And now we have continuous glucose monitors. So instead of having to prick my finger every time I want a reading, I can slap on one of these sensors, and it's just passively collecting readings like every 15 minutes. And you can now understand like what's happening while you're sleeping, while you're exercising, et cetera. And so we can go from something like this, where I have one data point, to something like this, where I could see an entire day of what was going on. And in this case, you could see like overnight, it turned out that I tend to go hypoglycemic overnight. My blood sugar actually dips to a lower level, which can also cause sleep disruptions. So I may have to adjust what I eat in the evening or my meal timing to make sure that I don't have that dip in the evening. After we wake up, our glucose rises for about the first hour afterwards as we pull glucose into our bloodstream to because we just woke up. And you can say breakfast, something I ate at lunch that day really had a bad effect on my blood sugar. And then in the evening, I had a soccer match, and you can see that there was a big spike up. And typically, that could be adrenaline, just the act of the excitement of competing. It tends to have like a cortisol spike as well. And there was a cool study a few years back where they wanted to understand the way individuals respond to different carbohydrates. So what they did here was they showed 2 individuals who consumed the same pure glucose drink as a control. So that's the red. So you can see like that's their baseline. And then they ate white bread. And you can see like one person, the white bread wasn't as bad as the glucose drink, but the other person had a worse response with the bread. And then on the other column, you're going to see the same sort of concept where one person had banana and cookies, and the banana was much worse than cookies. Cookies were actually pretty balanced, whereas the other person had like terrible response to cookies, when banana actually was a lowering effect. So I decided how I wanted to see how I would respond to different foods. So I started using my continuous glucose monitor. I would just eat individual foods. I'd be like, eating white rice. I would see that it spiked up my sugar, and it would stay sustained for a while. Whereas a banana, it has a pronounced peak, but it would taper back off. Apples, probably because there's fiber in it, it's like you'll see a delay, then it rises. And something like pea protein was negligible. But we don't often eat food in isolation. We're eating things in combination. So I also wanted to see how, for example, I can eat white rice, but if I had just like a little bit of oil, coconut oil or olive oil, in this case it was olive oil, it actually had a lowering effect. It actually reduced the spike of it. You can see something like I had some pea protein and added mango, and in that case, it was a slight change, but not too bad. In terms of other foods, like on the left is a meal that's very like paleo, probably close to, I won't call it keto because there are some sweet potatoes in there, but it didn't budge, right? My glucose just stayed steady with that meal. Whereas I went out to a Thai restaurant and had like these like rice noodles and chicken pad Thai, and that was just completely destroyed. my glucose response was terrible. And just to check out things like coffee and alcohol, obviously something like a bulletproof coffee, or there isn't going to be a spike with that. It's pretty stable. But what was interesting was certain alcohols would actually have a lowering effect versus spiking my blood sugar, which I would have expected. We can also talk about fasting. So I did a 3-day water fast, 72 hours, and this was my glucose response. And you can see that. Now, if we also measure ketones, we can now we have 2 data points, which is kind of cool because with glucose and ketones, there's a point where your body's shifting, where you're predominantly going from using glucose for energy to ketones for energy. And here I was doing it basically, at about the 66-hour mark, probably where it crossed over. So what I would probably do in the future, I would probably extend that fast a little bit, because I want to take advantage of it, because it was starting to take off. My ketones were starting to take off. So I would want to leverage that sort of high level of ketones, some people call it like a therapeutic level, for maybe another couple of days. And that's just the way I respond. Other people have very different curves when they do this. And so I'm going to wrap things up now, and but I want to end with a quick little story. So a few years back, I competed in my first half marathon, and it was like a really hot, humid morning, and everything was going great until about a quarter mile from the finish line. I began to bonk, and it was actually much worse. I metabolically broke down, and I basically passed out. And I woke up in an ambulance, hooked to an IV with some IV bags, all that. And I was fine. So it was the freak sort of thing. But imagine if I was wearing something while I was racing that would have alerted me to the fact that my blood sugar and electrolyte levels were going down. Like it would have said, hey, Bob, you should consume a sports drink or some gel or do something immediately. And I do think like we're getting to the point where we'll be getting that. It's one thing to track, but we want that feedback. We want to be told like, hey, move this, make this improvement, this change, and it may be day to day, maybe week to week. And I think even if you're not running a marathon every day, I think the takeaway from this story was that I almost got to my goal, but I was halted by something I could have prevented with information. And I'm really excited about where this is all going. And I don't think you have to overcomplicate the concept of tracking. A lot of what I've done, I've layered this. It's been built over years. So you can start simple, and you'll see over time, you'll start uncovering really great insights about yourself. That was me in the hospital. So, yep, full of IV. So that's my talk, and thanks again for everyone for your time. If you go to the website there, quantifiedbob.com/biohacking congress, I have links to all the resources that were in my talk.